Thomas Paine, Rights of Man. Rights of Man, being an answer to Mr. Burke's attack on the French Revolution. Among the incivilities by which nations or individuals provoke and irritate each other, Mr. Burke's pamphlet on the French Revolution is an extraordinary instance. There is scarcely an epithet of abuse to be found in the English language with which Mr. Burke has not loaded the French nation and the National Assembly. Everything which rancor, prejudice, ignorance, or knowledge could suggest is poured forth in the copious fury of near 400 pages. Mr. Burke, with his usual outrage, abused the Declaration of the Rights of Man, published by the National Assembly of France, as the basis on which the Constitution of France is built. This he calls paltry and blurred sheets of paper about the rights of man. Does Mr. Burke mean to deny that man has any rights? If he does, then he must mean that there are no such things as rights anywhere, and that he has none himself. For who is there in the world but man? But if Mr. Burke means to admit that man has rights, the question then will be, what are those rights, and how man came by them originally? The error of those who reason by precedents drawn from antiquity respecting the rights of man is that they do not go far enough into antiquity. They stop in some of the intermediate stages of 100 or 1,000 years and produce what was then done as a rule for the present day. This is no authority at all. If antiquity is to be authority, 1,000 such authorities may be produced, successively contradicting each other. But if we proceed on, we shall at last come out right. We shall come to the time when man came from the hand of his Maker. What was he then? Man. Man was his high and only title, and a higher cannot be given him. Though I mean not to touch upon any sectarian principle of religion, yet it may be worth observing that the genealogy of Christ is traced to Adam. Why then not trace the rights of man to the creation of man? Every history of the creation and every traditionary account all agree in establishing one point, the unity of man, by which I mean that men are all of one degree, and consequently that all men are born equal, and with equal natural right, and consequently every child born into the world must be considered as deriving its existence from God. The world is as new to him as it was to the first man that existed, and his natural right in it is of the same kind. The Mosaic account of the creation, whether taken as divine authority or merely historical, is full to this point, the unity or equality of man. The expression admits of no controversy. And God said, "Let us make man in our own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them." The distinction of sexes is pointed out, but no other distinction is even implied. If this be not divine authority, it is at least historical authority, and shows that the equality of man, so far from being a modern doctrine, is the oldest upon record. His natural rights are the foundation of all his civil rights. A few words will explain this. Natural rights are those which appertain to man in right of his existence. Of this kind are all the intellectual rights, or rights of the mind, and also all those rights of acting as an individual for his own comfort and happiness, which are not injurious to the natural rights of others. Civil rights are those which appertain to man in right of his being a member of society. Every civil right has for its foundation some natural right pre-existing in the individual, but to the enjoyment of which his individual power is not, in all cases, sufficiently competent. Of this kind are all those which relate to security and protection. From this short review, it will be easy to distinguish between that class of natural rights which man retains after entering into society and those which he throws into the common stock as a member of society. A man, by natural right, has a right to judge in his own cause. Every man is a proprietor in society and draws on the capital as a matter of right. It follows, then, that the power produced from the aggregate of natural rights, imperfect in power in the individual, cannot be applied to invade the natural rights which are retained in the individual, and in which the power to execute is as perfect as the right itself. Let us now apply these principles to governments. In casting our eyes over the world, it is extremely easy to distinguish the governments which have arisen out of society, or out of the social compact, from those which have not. But to place this in a clearer light, they may be all comprehended under three heads. First, superstition. Secondly, power. Thirdly, the common interest of society and the common rights of man. The first was a government of priestcraft, the second of conquerors, and the third of reason. When a set of artful men pretended, through the medium of oracles, to hold intercourse with the deity, as familiarly as they now march up the back stairs in European courts, the world was completely under the government of superstition. The oracles were consulted, and whatever they were made to say became the law, and this sort of government lasted as long as this sort of superstition lasted. After these, a race of conquerors arose, whose government, like that of William the Conqueror, was founded in power, and the sword assumed the name of a scepter. Governments thus established last as long as the power to support them lasts. But that they might avail themselves of every engine in their favor, they united fraud to force, and set up an idol which they called divine right, and which, in imitation of the Pope, who affects to be spiritual and temporal, and on contradiction to the founder of the Christian religion, twisted itself afterwards into an idol of another shape, called church and state. The key of St. Peter and the key of the treasury became quartered on one another, and the wondering cheated multitude worshipped the invention. When I contemplate the natural dignity of man, when I feel, for nature has not been kind enough to me to blunt my feelings, for the honor and happiness of its character, I become irritated at the attempt to govern mankind by force and fraud, as if they were all knaves and fools, and can scarcely avoid disgust at those who are thus imposed upon. We have now to review the governments which arise out of society. In such, the fact must be that the individuals themselves, each in his own personal and sovereign right, entered into a compact with each other to produce a government. And this is the only mode in which governments have a right to rise, and the only principle on which they have a right to exist. To possess ourselves of a clear idea of what government is, or ought to be, we must trace it to its origin. A constitution is not a thing in name only, but in fact. It has not an ideal, but a real existence, and wherever it cannot be produced in a visible form, there is none. A constitution is a thing antecedent to a government, and a government is only the creature of a constitution. The constitution of a country is not the act of its government, but of the people constituting its government. Can then Mr. Burke produce the English Constitution? If he cannot, for we may fairly conclude that though it has been much talked about, no such thing as a constitution exists, or ever did exist, and consequently that the people have yet a constitution to form. The English government is one of those which arose out of a conquest, and not out of society, and consequently it arose over the people. And though it has been much modified from the opportunity of circumstances since the time of William the Conqueror, The country has never yet regenerated itself, and is therefore without a constitution. Mr. Burke said in a speech last winter in Parliament that when the National Assembly first met in three orders, the tiers état, the clergy, and the noblesse, France had then a good constitution. This shows, among numerous other instances, that Mr. Burke does not understand what a constitution is. The persons so met were not a constitution, but a convention to make a constitution. I now proceed to draw some comparisons between the French Constitution and the governmental usages in England. The Constitution of France says that every man who pays a tax of 60 sous per annum is an elector. What article will Mr. Burke place against this? Can anything be more limited, and at the same time more capricious, than the qualification of electors is in England? The French Constitution says that the number of representatives for any place shall be in a ratio to the number of taxable inhabitants or electors. In England, the county of York, which contains nearly 1 million souls, sends 2 county members, and so does the county of Rutland, which contains not 1/100th part of that number. The old town of Sarum, which contains not 3 houses, sends 2 members, and the town of Manchester, which contains upward of 60,000 souls, is not admitted to send any. The French Constitution says that the National Assembly shall be elected every 2 years. What article will Mr. Burke place against this? Why, that the nation has no right at all in the case, that the government is perfectly arbitrary with respect to this point, and he can quote for his authority the precedent of a former parliament. The French Constitution says that the right of war and peace is in the nation. Where else should it reside but in those who are to pay the expense? In England, this right is said to reside in a metaphor shown at the Tower for 6d or a shilling apiece. So are the lions, and it would be a step nearer to reason to say it resided in them, for any inanimate metaphor is no more than a hat or a cap. We can all see the absurdity of worshipping Aaron's molten calf, or Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. But why do men continue to practice themselves the absurdities they despise in others? The French Constitution says there shall be no titles, and of consequence, all that class of equivocal generation which in some countries is called aristocracy, and in others nobility, is done away, and the peer is exalted into the man. Titles are but nicknames, and every nickname is a title. The thing is perfectly harmless in itself, but it marks a sort of foppery in the human character, which degrades it. It reduces man into the diminutive of man in things which are great, and the counterfeit of women in things which are little. It talks about its fine blue ribbon like a girl, and shows its new garter like a child. A certain writer of some antiquity says, "When I was a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things." It is from the elevated mind of France that the folly of titles has fallen. It has outgrown the baby clothes of count and duke, and breached itself in manhood. France has not leveled, it has exalted. It has put down the dwarf to set up the man. Let us then examine the grounds upon which the French Constitution has resolved against having a House of Peers in France. Because, in the first place, aristocracy is kept up by family tyranny and injustice. Secondly, because there is an unnatural unfitness in an aristocracy to be legislators for a nation. Thirdly, because the idea of hereditary legislators is as inconsistent as that of hereditary judges, or hereditary juries, and as absurd as a hereditary mathematician, or a hereditary wise man, and as ridiculous as a hereditary poet laureate. Fourthly, because a body of men holding themselves accountable to nobody ought not to be trusted by anybody. Fifthly, because it is continuing the uncivilized principle of governments founded in conquest, and the base idea of man having property in man, and governing him by personal right. Sixthly, because aristocracy has a tendency to deteriorate the human species. By the universal economy of nature it is known, and by the instance of the Jews it is proved, that the human species has a tendency to degenerate when separated from the general stock of society, and intermarrying constantly with each other. The French Constitution hath abolished or renounced toleration and intolerance also, and hath established universal right of conscience. Toleration is not the opposition of intolerance, but is the counterfeit of it. Both are despotisms. The one assumes to itself the right of withholding liberty of conscience, and the other of granting it. The one is the Pope armed with fire and faggot, and the other is the Pope selling or granting indulgences. The former is church and state, and the latter is church and traffic. Were a bill brought into any parliament entitled, "An Act to tolerate or grant liberty to the Almighty to receive the worship of a Jew or Turk, or to prohibit the Almighty from receiving it," all men would startle and call it blasphemy. There would be an uproar. The presumption of toleration in religious matters would then present itself unmasked. Who then art thou, vain dust and ashes? By whatever name thou art called, whether a king, a bishop, a church, or a state, parliament, or anything else, that obtrudest thine insignificance between the soul of man and its Maker. Mind thine own concerns. If he believes not as thou believest, it is a proof that thou believest not as he believes, and there is no earthly power can determine between you. The Inquisition in Spain and the persecution of dissenters in England does not proceed from the religion originally professed, but from this mule animal engendered between the church and the state. Persecution is not an original feature in any religion, but it is always the strongly marked feature of all law religions, or religions established by law. Take away the law establishment, and every religion reassumes its original benignity. In America, a Catholic priest is a good citizen, a good character, and a good neighbor. An Episcopalian minister is of the same description, and this proceeds independently of the men, for there being no law establishment in America. One of the first works of the National Assembly in France, instead of vindictive proclamations against dissent, as has been the case with other governments, was to publish a Declaration of the Rights of Man, as the basis on which the new Constitution was to be built, and which is here subjoined. Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizens by the National Assembly of France. The representatives of the people of France, formed into a National Assembly, doth recognize and declare, in the presence of the Supreme Being, and with the hope of his blessing and favor, the following sacred rights of men and of citizens. 1. Men are born and continue free and equal in respect of their rights. 2. The end of all political associations is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man, liberty, property, security, and resistance of oppression. 3. The nation is the source of all sovereignty. 4. Political liberty consists in the power of doing whatever does not injure another. 5. The law ought to prohibit only actions hurtful to society. What is not prohibited should not be hindered. 6. The law is an expression of the will of the community. All citizens have a right to concur, either personally or by their representatives, in its formation. 7. No man should be accused, arrested, or held in confinement except in cases determined by the law. 8. The law ought to impose no other penalties but such as are absolutely and evidently necessary. 9. Every man being presumed innocent till he has been convicted. 10. No man ought to be molested on account of his opinions, not even on account of his religious opinions, provided his avowal of them does not disturb the public order. 11. Citizens may speak, write, and publish freely. 12. A public force is instituted for the benefit of the community and not for the particular benefit of the persons to whom it is entrusted. 13. Contributions for defraying the expenses of government ought to be divided equally among the members of the community, according to their abilities. 14. Every citizen has a right, either by himself or as representative, to a free voice in determining the necessity of public contributions. 15. Every community has a right to demand of all its agents an account of their conduct. 16. Every community in which a separation of powers and a security of rights is not provided for wants a constitution. 17. The right to property being inviolable and sacred, no one ought to be deprived of it, except in cases of evident public necessity. Miscellaneous chapter. The opinions of men with respect to government are changing fast in all countries. The revolutions of America and France have thrown a beam of light all over the world, which reaches into man. The enormous expense of governments has provoked people to think by making them feel, and when once the veil begins to rend, it admits not of repair. Ignorance is of a peculiar nature. Once dispelled, it is impossible to reestablish it. It is not originally a thing of itself, but is only the absence of knowledge, and though man may be kept ignorant, he cannot be made ignorant. The rights of men in society are neither divisible or transferable, nor annihilable, but are distendable only, and it is not in the power of any generation to intercept finally and cut off the descent. If the present generation or any other are disposed to be slaves, it does not lessen the right of the succeeding generations to be free. Wrongs cannot have a legal descent. When Mr. Burke attempts to maintain that the English nation did at the Revolution of 1688 most solemnly renounce and abdicate their rights for themselves, and for all their posterity forever, he speaks a language that merits not reply, and which can only excite contempt for his prostitute principles, or pity for his ignorance. Conclusion. Reason and ignorance, the opposite of each other, influence the great bulk of mankind. If either of these can be rendered sufficiently extensive in a country, the machinery of government goes easily on. Reason obeys itself, and ignorance submits to whatever is dictated to it. When we survey the wretched condition of man under the monarchical and hereditary systems of government, dragged from his home by one power or driven by another, and impoverished by taxes more than by enemies, it becomes evident that those systems are bad, and that a general revolution in the principle and construction of government is necessary. What is government more than the management of the affairs of a nation? It is not, and from its nature cannot be, the property of any particular man or family, but of the whole community, at whose expense it is supported. And though by force and contrivance it has been usurped into an inheritance, the usurpation cannot alter the right of things. Sovereignty, as a matter of right, appertains to the nation only, and not to any individual. And a nation has at all times an inherent indefeasible right to abolish any form of government it finds inconvenient, and to establish such as accords with its interest, disposition, and happiness. Why are not republics plunged into war, but because the nature of their government does not admit of an interest distinct from that of the nation? Even Holland, though an ill-constructed republic, and with a commerce extending over the world, existed nearly a century without war. As it is not difficult to perceive, from the enlightened state of mankind, that hereditary governments are verging to their decline, and that revolutions on the broad basis of natural sovereignty and government by representation are making their way in Europe, it would be an act of wisdom to anticipate their approach and produce revolutions by reason and accommodation rather than commit them to the issue of convulsions. Rights of Man, Part 2nd, Combining Principle and Practice. To M. de Lafayette. After an acquaintance of nearly 15 years in difficult situations in America and various consultations in Europe, I feel a pleasure in presenting to you this small treatise in gratitude for your services to my beloved America, and as a testimony of my esteem for the virtues, public and private, which I know you to possess. Your sincere, affectionate friend, Thomas Paine, London, February 9th, 1792. Introduction. The independence of America, considered merely as a separation from England, would have been a matter but of little importance had it not been accompanied by a revolution in the principles and practice of governments. She made a stand not for herself only, but for the world, and looked beyond the advantages herself could receive. As America was the only spot in the political world where the principle of universal reformation could begin, so also was it the best in the natural world. An assemblage of circumstances conspired not only to give birth, but to add gigantic maturity to its principles. The scene which the country presents to the eye of a spectator has something in it which generates and encourages great ideas. If systems of government can be introduced less expensive and more productive of general happiness than those which have existed, all attempts to oppose their progress will in the end be fruitless. Reason, like time, will make its own way, and prejudice will fall in a combat with interest. If universal peace, civilization, and commerce are ever to be the happy lot of man, it cannot be accomplished but by a revolution in the system of governments. The danger to which the success of revolutions is most exposed is that of attempting them before the principles on which they proceed and the advantages to result from them are sufficiently seen and understood. Almost everything appertaining to the circumstances of a nation has been absorbed and confounded under the general and mysterious world of government. It may therefore be of use this day of revolutions to discriminate between those things which are the effect of government and those which are not. Chapter 1. Of Society and Civilization. A great part of that order which reigns among mankind is not the effect of government. It has its origin in the principles of society and the natural constitution of man. It existed prior to government, and would exist if the formality of government was abolished. The mutual dependence and reciprocal interest which man has upon man, and all the parts of civilized community upon each other, create that great chain of connection which holds it together. The landholder, the farmer, the manufacturer, the merchant, the tradesman, and every occupation prospers by the aid which each receives from the other and from the whole. Common interest regulates their concerns and forms their law, and the laws which common usage ordains have a greater influence than the laws of government. To understand the nature and quantity of government proper for man, it is necessary to attend to his character. As nature created him for social life, she fitted him for the station she intended. In all cases, she made his natural wants greater than his individual powers. No one man is capable, without the aid of society, of supplying his own wants, and those wants, acting upon every individual, impel the whole of them into society, as naturally as gravitation acts to a center. For upwards of 2 years from the commencement of the American War, and to a longer period in several of the American states, there were no established forms of government. The old governments had been abolished, and the country was too much occupied in defense to employ its attention in establishing new governments. Yet during this interval, order and harmony were preserved as inviolate as in any country in Europe. There is a natural aptness in man, and more so in society, because it embraces a greater variety of abilities and resource to accommodate itself to whatever situation it is in. The instant formal government is abolished, society begins to act. A general association takes place, and common interest produces common security. The more perfect civilization is, the less occasion has it for government, because the more does it regulate its own affairs and govern itself. But so contrary is the practice of old governments to the reason of the case, that the expenses of them increase in the proportion they ought to diminish. It is but few general laws that civilized life requires, and those of such common usefulness, that whether they are enforced by the forms of government or not, the effect will be nearly the same. If we consider what the principles are that first condense men into society, and what are the motives that regulate their mutual intercourse afterwards, we shall find, by the time we arrive at what is called government, that nearly the whole of the business is performed by the natural operation of the parts upon each other. Man, with respect to all those matters, is more a creature of consistency than he is aware, or than governments would wish him to believe. All the great laws of society are laws of nature. Those of trade and commerce are laws of mutual and reciprocal interest. They are followed and obeyed because it is the interest of the parties so to do, and not on account of any formal laws their governments may impose or interpose. But how often is the natural propensity to society disturbed or destroyed by the operations of government, when the latter, instead of being engrafted on the principles of the former, assumes to exist for itself, and acts by partialities of favor and oppression, it becomes the cause of the mischiefs it ought to prevent. Chapter 2. Of the origins of the present old governments. It is impossible that such governments as have hitherto existed in the world could have commenced by any other means than a total violation of every principle sacred and moral. The obscurity in which the origin of all the present old governments is buried implies the iniquity and disgrace with which they began. It could have been no difficult thing in the early and solitary ages of the world, while the chief employment of men was that of attending flocks and herds, for a banditti of ruffians to overrun a country and lay it under contributions. Their power being thus established, the chief of the band contrived to lose the name of robber and that of monarch, and hence the origin of monarchy and kings. From such beginning of governments, what could be expected but a continued system of war and extortion? Chapter 3. Of the old and new systems of government. Government on the old system is an assumption of power for the aggrandizement of itself. On the new, a delegation of power for the common benefit of society. The first general distinction between those two systems is that the one now called the old is hereditary, either in whole or in part, and the new is entirely representative. It rejects all hereditary government. First, as being an imposition on mankind. Secondly, as inadequate to the purposes for which government is necessary. All hereditary government is in its nature tyranny. To inherit a government is to inherit the people, as if they were flocks and herds. Kings succeed each other, not as rationals, but as animals. It signifies not what their mental or moral characters are. It appears under all the various characters of childhood, decrepitude, dotage, a thing at nurse, in leading strings or in crutches. It reverses the wholesome order of nature. It occasionally puts children over men, and the conceits of nonage over wisdom and experience. In short, we cannot conceive a more ridiculous figure of government than hereditary succession, in all its cases, presents. The representative system takes society and civilization for its basis, nature, reason, and experience for its guide. Simple democracy was society governing itself without the aid of secondary means. By engrafting representation upon democracy, we arrive at a system of government capable of embracing and confederating all the various interests and every extent of territory and population, and that also with advantages as much superior to hereditary government as the Republic of Letters is to hereditary literature. Monarchy is all a bubble, a mere artifice to procure money. The whole expense of the federal government of America, founded on the system of representation and extending over a country nearly 10 times as large as England, is but $600,000, or 135,000 pounds sterling. I assume that no man in his sober senses will compare the character of any of the kings of Europe with that of General Washington. Yet in France, and also in England, the expense of the civil list only for the support of one man is 8 times greater than the whole expense of the federal government in America. To assign a reason for this appears almost impossible. The government of a free country, properly speaking, is not in the persons, but in the laws. The enacting of those requires no great expense, and when they are administered, the whole of civil government is performed. The rest is all court contrivance. Chapter 4 of Constitutions. That men mean distinct and separate things when they speak of constitutions and of governments is evident. Or why are those terms distinctly and separately used? A constitution is not the act of a government, but of a people constituting a government, and government without a constitution is power without a right. Government is nothing more than a national association, and the object of this association is the good of all, as well individually as collectively. Every man wishes to pursue his occupation and to enjoy the fruits of his labors and the produce of his property in peace and safety and with the least possible expense. When these things are accomplished, all the objects for which government ought to be established are answered. Considering government is the only light in which it should be considered, that of a national association. It ought to be constructed as not to be disordered by any accident happening among the parts, and therefore no extraordinary power, capable of producing such an effect, should be lodged in the hands of any individual. The death, sickness, absence, or defection of any one individual in a government ought to be a matter of no more consequence with respect to the nation than if the same circumstance had taken place in a member of the English Parliament or the French National Assembly. Monarchy would not have continued so many ages in the world had it not been for the abuses it protects. It is the master fraud which shelters all others. By admitting a participation of the spoil, it makes itself friends, and when it ceases to do this, it will cease to be the idol of courtiers. The principle upon which Mr. Burke formed his political creed, that of binding and controlling posterity to the end of time, and of renouncing and abdicating the rights of all posterity forever, is now become too detestable to be made a subject of debate, and therefore I pass it over with no other notice than exposing it. The best constitution that could now be devised, consistent with the condition of the present moment, may be far short of that excellence which a few years may afford. There is a morning of reason rising upon man on the subject of government that has not appeared before. The trade of courts is beginning to be understood, and the affectation of mystery, with all the artificial sorcery by which they imposed upon mankind, is on the decline. It has received its death wound, and though it may linger, it will expire. Government ought to be as much open to improvement as anything which appertains to man, instead of which it has been monopolized from age to age by the most ignorant and vicious of the human race. Need we any other proof of their wretched management than the excess of debts and taxes with which every nation groans, and the quarrels into which they have precipitated the world. Just emerging from such a barbarous condition, it is too soon to determine to what extent of improvement government may yet be carried. For what we can foresee, all Europe may form but one great republic, and man be free of the whole. Chapter 5. Ways and means of improving the condition of Europe, interspersed with miscellaneous observations. Whatever the form or constitution of government may be, it ought to have no other object than the general happiness. When instead of this it operates to create and increase wretchedness in any of the parts of society, it is on a wrong system, and reformation is necessary. As it is necessary to include England in the prospect of a general reformation, it is proper to inquire into the defects of its government. It is only by each nation reforming its own that the whole can be improved, and the full benefit of reformation enjoyed. Only partial advantages can flow from partial reforms. When, in countries that are called civilized, we see age going to the workhouse and youth to the gallows, something must be wrong in the system of government. Why is it that scarcely any are executed but the poor? The fact is a proof, among other things, of a wretchedness in their condition. Bred up without morals and cast upon the world without a prospect, they are the exposed sacrifice of vice and legal barbarity. Knowing my own heart and feeling myself as I now do, superior to all the skirmish of party, the inveteracy of interested or mistaken opponents, I answer not to falsehood or abuse, but proceed to the defects of the English government. I begin with charters and corporations, and the evil of those Gothic institutions, the corporation towns. As one of the House of the English Parliament is, in a great measure, made up of elections from these corporations, and as it is unnatural that a pure stream should flow from a foul fountain, its vices are but a continuation of the vices of its origin. A man of moral honor and good political principles cannot submit to the mean drudgery and disgraceful arts by which such elections are carried. To be a successful candidate, he must be destitute of the qualities that constitute a just legislator, and being thus disciplined to corruption by the mode of entering into Parliament, it is not to be expected that the representative should be better than the man. But it is not in the representation only that the defects lie, and therefore I proceed into the next place, to the aristocracy. What is called the House of Peers is combination of persons in one common interest. No better reason can be given why a house of legislation should be composed entirely of men whose occupation consists in letting landed property, then why it should be composed of those who hire, or of brewers or bakers, or any other separate class of men. Mr. Burke calls this house the great ground and pillar of security to the landed interest. What pillar of security does the landed interest require more than any other interest in the state? Or what right has it to a distinct and separate representation from the general interest of a nation? In stating these matters, I speak in open and disinterested language, dictated by no passion but that of humanity. To me, who have not only refused offers because I thought them improper, but have declined towards I might with reputation have accepted, it is no wonder that meanness and imposition appear disgustful. Independence is my happiness, and I view things as they are, without regard to place or person. My country is the world, and my religion is to do good. Having thus glanced at some of the defects of the two Houses of Parliament, I proceed to what is called the Crown. It signifies a nominal office of £1,000,000 sterling a year, the business of which consists in receiving the money. Whether the person be wise or foolish, sane or insane, a native or a foreigner, matters not. Every ministry acts upon the same idea that Mr. Burke writes, namely, that the people must be hoodwinked, and held in superstitious ignorance by some bugbear or other, and what is called the crown answers this purpose, and therefore it answers all the purposes to be expected from it. This is more than can be said of the other two branches. The hazard to which this office is exposed in all countries is not from anything that can happen to the man, but from what may happen to the nation, the danger of its coming to its senses. I shall now turn to the matter of lessening the burthen of taxes. Since the year 1788, upwards of 1 million new taxes have been laid on, besides the produce of the lotteries, and as the taxes have in general been more productive since than before, the amount may be taken in round numbers at 17 million pounds, about 9 millions of which are appropriated to the payment of interest on the national debt, and 8 to the current annual expenses. All circumstances arising from the French Revolution and the approaching harmony of the two nations and the progress of knowledge in the science of government, the annual expenditure might be put back to 1.5 million. Thus, there will remain a surplus of upwards of 6 millions out of the present current expenses. The question then will be how to dispose of this surplus. The first step of practical relief would be to abolish the poor rates entirely, and in lieu thereof, to make a remission of taxes to the poor of double the amount of the present poor rates, viz., 4 millions annually out of the surplus taxes. By this measure, the poor would be benefited 2 millions, and the housekeepers 2 millions. This alone would be equal to a reduction of 120 millions of the national debt, and consequently equal to the whole expense of the American War. This money would be contributed so as to provide £4 annually per head for the support of children of poor families, and to provide also for the cost of education of over 1 million children, to give annuities of £10 each for the aged poor over 60, and of £6 each for the poor over 50, to give donations of £1 each on occasions of birth in poor families and marriages of the poor, to make allowances for funeral expenses of persons traveling for work and dying at a distance from their friends, and to furnish employment for the casual poor of the metropolis where modes of relief are necessary that are not required in the country. When it shall be said in any country in the world, my poor are happy, my jails are empty of prisoners, my streets of beggars, the aged are not in want, the taxes are not oppressive, the rational world is my friend, because I am the friend of its happiness, then may that country boast its constitution and its government. Never did so great an opportunity offer itself to England and to all Europe as is produced by the two revolutions of America and France. By the former, freedom has a national champion in the Western world, and by the latter, in Europe. When another nation shall join France, despotism and bad government will scarcely dare to appear. To use a trite expression, the iron is becoming hot all over Europe. The insulted German and the enslaved Spaniard, the Russ and the Pole are beginning to think. The present age will hereafter merit to be called the age of reason, and the present generation will appear to the future as the Adam of a new world. I have carefully avoided to enlarge upon the subject because I am inclined to believe that what is called the present ministry wished to see contentions about religion kept up, to prevent the nation turning its attentions to subjects of government. But as religion is very improperly made a political machine, and the reality of it is thereby destroyed, why may we not suppose that the great Father of all is pleased with variety of devotion, and that the greatest offense we can act is that by which we seek to torment and render each other miserable? As to what are called national religions, we may, with as much propriety, talk of national gods. It is either political craft or the remains of the pagan system when every nation had its separate and particular deity. It is now towards the middle of February. Were I to take a turn into the country, the trees would present a leafless, wintry appearance. Yet people might by chance observe that a single bud on a twig had begun to swell. I should reason very unnaturally to suppose this was the only bud in England which had this appearance. It is, however, not difficult to perceive that the spring is begun.